On October 2, 2025, the Supreme Court of Tennessee scheduled 4 executions for 2026. Among the names set for execution was Gary Wayne Sutton, a man who has lived under the shadow of capital punishment for over 3 decades. Sutton's execution is scheduled for December 3, 2026. He was convicted in connection with the deaths of 2 people in 1992, his close friend Tommy Griffin and Griffin's sister, Connie Branam. In a rare legal contest that has drawn attention from lawyers, advocates, and families on both sides, Sutton has consistently stated he did not commit these crimes. His lawyers argue the evidence in the case was built on scientific testimony later discredited and questioned by experts. As this documentary unfolds, we will present what happened that year, how the investigation developed, and why this case remains controversial so many years later. We will examine what the courts decided, what supporters of Sutton argue, and how the legal system has responded to the ongoing debate about his guilt and sentence. If you are watching this video to understand the truth behind the conviction and why questions linger after more than 30 years, make sure you are subscribed to the Execution Lab, because we will walk through every verified fact in this case with clarity and precision. Sutton's story begins in early 1992 in East Tennessee, where a series of events set in motion one of the most debated capital punishment cases in the state's history. In the following chapters, we will outline the critical events leading up to the deaths of Tommy Griffin and Connie Branam, how the investigation unfolded, the evidence presented at trial, and the appeals that followed. We will also present statements from the prosecution and from Sutton's defense, including concerns raised about the credibility of key expert testimony. By the end of this documentary, you will have a detailed understanding of this case that goes beyond headlines, and you will be equipped to form an informed opinion about the questions that have persisted for more than 3 decades. This case reminds us that the justice system is built on procedures designed to protect every individual, even those accused of the most serious crimes. The meticulous steps of investigation, trial, and appeals exist not only to find the truth but to ensure fairness at every stage. As this case unfolds, we are reminded how essential it is for the law to follow its own rules, leaving no room for oversight or error. Before we proceed, if you care about understanding how the justice system handles capital cases with complex histories, subscribe now to the Execution Lab and turn on notifications so you never miss an in-depth analysis like this one. In February of 1992, 2 lives in East Tennessee intersected in a way that would lead to tragedy and a legal battle lasting more than 3 decades. Tommy Mayford Griffin was 24 years old. He lived in the rural communities near Sevier and Blount counties. Friends described Griffin as someone who belonged to a tight-knit circle, often seen around town with people he knew from work and social gatherings. At the time, he worked regularly, kept to his routine, and had deep family ties, including a sister who never gave up looking for him when he failed to come home. Griffin's sister, Connie Branam, was in her mid-30s. She was known locally for her commitment to her brother and extended family. When Griffin went missing, Branam did not wait. She took action, driving into Blount County to search for him and asking anyone who might have seen him to come forward. Her determination reflected a family unwilling to sit idle in the face of uncertainty. In contrast to the victims, Gary Wayne Sutton was 22 years old in early 1992. Born in March of 1969, Sutton grew up in East Tennessee and experienced significant challenges in his youth, including family disruptions and early responsibilities that shaped his social life. Over the years, he formed close bonds with people in his community, including the Griffin family. Court records note that Sutton and Griffin knew each other socially and had spent extended time together in the weeks leading up to February 1992. Sutton's background included time outside Tennessee as well. In the early 1980s, he had a prior conviction for aggravated assault in Georgia, a matter unrelated to the events of 1992 but one that later came up during sentencing. Reports from those who knew him described him as someone with artistic interests and capable of generous acts, including helping family members in times of need. These testimonies were presented to the court as part of mitigation evidence during later legal proceedings. Another key figure in the background was James Henderson Dellinger, Sutton's uncle. Dellinger was a familiar presence in the same rural neighborhoods and social circles. He and Sutton spent time together with Griffin, especially on the afternoon of February 21, 1992, when the three were seen together at a local bar. The social proximity of these men, friends and family linked through community and daily routines, became central to how investigators and prosecutors framed their involvement in the events that unfolded that weekend. In reviewing the backgrounds of these individuals, it is important to note that no official motive was ever established in court records. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike acknowledged that Griffin and Branam had no documented reason to expect harm from Sutton or Dellinger. The state's case rested on circumstantial connections rather than direct proof of intent or motive. Although Sutton maintained relationships in his community, his academic and emotional profile was also brought into focus during legal proceedings. Expert evaluations cited limitations in intellectual functioning and documented early use of alcohol, factors that defense counsel argued should be considered in interpreting his behavior and decision-making. These assessments became part of the broader legal narrative, even as the courts maintained the convictions. As these backgrounds converged in late February 1992, the pattern of relationships, social habits, and community ties would come under intense scrutiny by law enforcement and, ultimately, the court system. In early 1992, a sequence of ordinary routines and social interactions set the stage for events that would reverberate through the Tennessee justice system for more than 30 years. In February of that year, Tommy Griffin, James Henderson Dellinger, and Gary Wayne Sutton spent much of an afternoon together at Howie's Hideaway Lounge on Highway 321 in Maryville, Tennessee. Friends and acquaintances saw them that day drinking beer, playing pool, and talking as people in their 20s often did. Witnesses who later testified in court agreed that there was no visible disagreement among the men as they left the bar together at around 7 o'clock in the evening. Shortly after leaving the lounge, two motorists observed the same three individuals on the side of Alcoa Highway near the Hunt Road exit. One witness used a portable radio to report what appeared to be a confrontation involving all three men at the edge of the multiple highway. Another witness reported a person walking along the roadside without a shirt or shoes in that vicinity during that same time frame. Law enforcement records show that several minutes later, a county officer encountered Tommy Griffin and took him into custody on a public intoxication charge. At the time, Griffin was unable or unwilling to explain what had occurred or to identify the other men with him. For the next several hours, he was held in the Blount County Jail as part of routine processing. During this period, James Dellinger visited the jail to inquire about Griffin's status. According to court filings, the officer explained the department's policy and the expected release time frame. After returning home, Dellinger came back to the jail later that night, accompanied by Gary Sutton, and secured Griffin's release by posting his bond. At around 9 p.m. that same evening, a neighbor reported seeing flames and smoke in the direction of Griffin's trailer. Law enforcement later connected a fire at that location to the broader sequence of events unfolding that night. In the days that followed, law enforcement teams from Blount County and Sevier County began coordinating their efforts. Investigators treated the disappearance and the fire at Griffin's trailer as significant developments and worked to establish whether they were related. Personnel at both agencies gathered witness statements, physical evidence, and early reports from officers who had encountered the group on Alcoa Highway the night of February 21, 1992. Detectives also reviewed the actions of Sutton and Dellinger that afternoon and evening, including their decision to secure Griffin's release from jail and the statements provided to law enforcement by multiple independent observers. Even at this early stage, questions arose about the order of events and the reliability of certain testimony. However, no immediate connection was made at that time between the activities on the highway, the fire at the trailer, and subsequent discoveries that would ultimately link these events in the legal proceedings that followed. Sutton had no documented history of violence directly tied to either Griffin or Branam, and no clear motive was established in the investigative records at this point. The inquiry into what happened that night continued as officers grappled with multiple strands of information, seeking to make sense of a situation that began as a routine social afternoon and increasingly appeared to be anything but ordinary. In the late afternoon of February 21, 1992, three men, Tommy Mayford Griffin, James Henderson Dellinger, and Gary Wayne Sutton, were seen together at a small bar on Highway 321 known locally as Howie's Hideaway Lounge. According to witness testimony entered at trial, the trio drank and played pool for hours and left together around early evening. Observers noted that within the bar, there was no sign of conflict among them. By approximately 7 p.m., at a location on Alcoa Highway near the Hunt Road exit, two motorists reported seeing three men at the side of a parked car. One witness used a radio to contact emergency dispatch. Another motorist reported seeing a man without shoes or a shirt walking along the roadside in that same area. These reports became part of the law enforcement documentation of that night's events. While those reports were being logged, an officer from the Blount County Sheriff's Department encountered Tommy Griffin near the same highway area. He appeared intoxicated and was unable to explain his circumstances. Griffin was taken into custody for public intoxication at approximately 7:40 p.m. and brought to the local jail. Sheriff's Department policy dictated a minimum 4-hour hold for such charges. Shortly after Griffin's booking, James Dellinger arrived at the jail seeking information about Griffin's condition and release. The officer advised Dellinger on detainment policies and suggested he return later. Roughly an hour later, Dellinger returned with Wayne Sutton. Together they arranged for Griffin's release by posting bond at around 11:30 p.m., significantly later than the initial arrest. Following Griffin's release from jail, the sequence of events becomes critical to the prosecution's case. Investigators later established a timeline that tied the activities of the three men that evening to two major incidents: the disappearance of Griffin after leaving the jail and the discovery of a vehicle fire involving Griffin's relative, Connie Branam, in a wooded area the following week. Evidence recovered from the field and physical items linked to these incidents became central to the criminal charges that would be filed. Law enforcement conducted searches that included the recovery of ballistic evidence from the scene where Griffin's remains were found and comparisons to items obtained during a search of Dellinger's residence. The results of these comparisons, presented in later trials, connected shell casings from the site to ammunition located in Dellinger's home. This physical evidence formed part of the state's case tying the movements of Dellinger and Sutton to the events of that night, according to court records. During the initial investigative phase, officers documented statements and observations from witnesses and checked visual and physical evidence for consistency. In parallel, investigators reviewed the interactions between Griffin, Dellinger, and Sutton from earlier that day. At that stage of the inquiry, authorities were attempting to establish a cohesive narrative that could explain Griffin's movements and his disappearance shortly after leaving the jail at night. Because Griffin did not return home and was not heard from again after his release, law enforcement units initiated wider area searches, field interviews, and scene documentation. These early activities set the foundation for charging decisions and the sequence of court proceedings that would follow. No official motive for the events of that night was documented in the early reports, and no single, definitive explanation was provided by law enforcement at the time of these initial actions. If the precision of this investigation and how evidence was pieced together matters to you, and you want full breakdowns of every angle in cases like this, subscribe to the Execution Lab right now. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this sequence raises the biggest question for you? Your insight helps shape deeper discussions around cases with real legal complexity. In the wake of the early investigative actions, law enforcement teams from Blount and Sevier counties began methodically piecing together what would become a complex body of evidence. Evidence in this case rested largely on physical items and witness accounts that helped establish a timeline of interactions involving Tommy Griffin, Wayne Sutton, and James Henderson Dellinger following the events of February 21, 1992. On February 24, 1992, at approximately mid-afternoon, a fisherman reported what appeared to be an unattended man near a popular public swimming hole known locally as Blue Hole. Officers responding to the call later identified the individual as Tommy Griffin. Identification was later confirmed through state records and family notifications. The location and positioning of the remains, along with items found nearby, became integral to the documentation of the case. Investigators found several spent shotgun shell casings near that site. Law enforcement technicians later determined these casings matched shotgun ammunition discovered during searches related to the investigation. A systematic comparison by field technicians and ballistic units connected the ammunition at the scene to ammunition linked to property associated with James Dellinger. This linkage was presented by the prosecution as part of the chain of evidence connecting Dellinger and Sutton to the events surrounding Griffin's death. A separate lead developed when local search parties located a burned vehicle on February 28, 1992, in a wooded area of Sevier County. Law enforcement documented the condition and location of the vehicle, and identification by dental records confirmed the remains of Connie Branam were inside. The vehicle's condition and associated evidence quickly drew the attention of arson investigators. Clay County arson specialists examined the scene, documenting remnants that indicated an external ignition source had been used. Their findings became part of the official investigative record. Investigators also located a rifle shell casing in the vicinity of that burned vehicle. A ballistics expert testified at later hearings that this casing had been fired from a .303 rifle that law enforcement had seized months earlier from the residence of James Dellinger. This evidence was included by prosecutors in both the Blount County and Sevier County cases and was accepted by the trial courts as relevant to identity and activity related to the deaths. The admissibility of this item and its associated link was contested by defense counsel but upheld through appeal. During this phase, detectives also reviewed witness statements regarding observations in the hours following Griffin's disappearance. Multiple independent accounts reported seeing vehicles and individuals at significant locations around the same timeline investigators later reconstructed. These accounts, along with the physical evidence, contributed to the state's argument that Sutton and Dellinger were present and involved in the sequence of events ending with the discovery of Griffin's and Branam's remains. As investigators compiled reports on these findings, they worked to document and preserve the chain of physical evidence. At the same time, forensic teams produced analysis reports intended to establish connections between exhibits, locations, and known movements of the individuals involved. The accumulation of this evidence became central to the prosecution's case in both counties, forming the basis for the charges that were later presented to grand juries. Following months of investigation, law enforcement in Blount and Sevier counties moved to formalize charges against Wayne Sutton and his uncle, James Henderson Dellinger. On April 6, 1992, a grand jury in Blount County returned an indictment charging both men with first-degree murder in connection with the death of Tommy Mayford Griffin. A companion process in Sevier County charged them with first-degree murder in the death of Connie Branam, along with a separate charge for the burning of personal property. These legal actions marked the pivot from investigation to formal prosecution and set into motion a sequence of trials that would extend for years. In Sevier County, Sutton and Dellinger were tried first for the death of Branam. Prosecutors presented physical evidence linking the scene where Branam's remains were found to items seized at Dellinger's residence. One such item was a rifle shell discovered in the vehicle, which ballistics analysis tied to a rifle located at Dellinger's property. These findings were used to establish a pattern of circumstances that the state argued supported culpability. During this trial, counsel for Sutton and Dellinger called mitigation witnesses to describe personal histories, character, and social context. Witnesses spoke of family relationships, upbringing, and personal challenges faced by both men. Sutton's supporters described his contributions to family life, including work history and personal responsibilities. Dellinger's defense highlighted elements of his upbringing and psychological assessments indicating limitations in cognitive functioning and social judgment. These factors were presented to the jury as part of the effort to humanize the defendants and provide context for their behavior. The jury in Sevier County convicted both Sutton and Dellinger of the murder charge and the related property offense. Each received a life sentence for the murder conviction and a 2-year consecutive sentence for the property charge. This outcome set the stage for the next phase of litigation in Blount County, where Sutton and Dellinger were subsequently tried for the death of Griffin. In Blount County, prosecutors again relied on circumstantial evidence, witness observations, and ballistic comparisons. The state's case included the testimony of forensic technicians and law enforcement personnel who outlined the timeline of events from the evening of February 21, 1992, through early returns of critical evidence. Witnesses recounted vehicle movements, shell casing matches, and coordinated findings that placed Sutton and Dellinger in proximity to key locations and moments under investigation. Defense counsel raised multiple challenges to the evidence and argued that gaps in the state's narrative cast doubt on the conclusions presented. Sutton's legal team asserted there was no proven motive and no direct evidence tying him to the decisive actions alleged by prosecutors. The defense also questioned aspects of expert testimony introduced by the state, including the credibility of certain scientific opinion at trial. After deliberation, the Blount County jury returned verdicts convicting both Sutton and Dellinger of first-degree murder in connection with Griffin's death. The conviction was followed by a sentencing phase in which the jury considered aggravating and mitigating factors. Based on statutory guidelines, one of the key aggravators applied by the state was the defendant's prior conviction in Sevier County for Branam's murder. This aggravated circumstance carried weight in the decision to impose capital sentences on both men. Upon sentencing, both Sutton and Dellinger received the death penalty for Griffin's murder. The legal record shows the court found the aggravating factors sufficiently outweighing any mitigation evidence presented. These decisions were later affirmed on direct appeal, effectively concluding the initial rounds of trial and appellate review at the state level. The formal indictment and consecutive convictions in Sevier and Blount counties illustrate the procedural pathway from investigation to punishment. What began as separate findings led to coordinated prosecutorial strategies over multiple jurisdictions. The layered structure of these trials provided a foundation for years of additional legal activity, including post-conviction petitions and appeals that would follow in state and federal courts. After the convictions and sentencing phases concluded, Wayne Sutton and his legal team shifted focus to the next phase of the legal process, post-conviction relief and appeals. In the mid-2000s, Sutton filed a petition seeking relief from his 1992 conviction and death sentence based on claims that multiple aspects of his original trial and subsequent procedures were flawed. On March 3, 2003, Sutton submitted a petition stating that his trial counsel had not provided effective representation during the capital case. His filing asserted that his attorneys lacked the training and experience necessary for handling the complexities of a capital trial, and that areas of defense strategy, document preparation, and expert support had been deficient. Counsel also claimed that they did not prepare adequately for the sentencing phase of the trial. The petition further argued that the prosecution had failed to disclose information that could have pointed to an alternate suspect. Sutton's legal team referenced a possible individual named Lester Festus Johnson, whose name appeared in some investigative materials but was not followed up in a way that could have clarified his relevance to the case. According to the petition, this failure hindered the defense's ability to challenge the state's narrative and may have affected the outcome of the trial. Another claim centered on how the indictment itself was drafted. Sutton's team argued that the indictment did not incorporate statutory aggravating circumstances that were necessary to sustain a death sentence. They contended this procedural issue raised questions about whether the punishment phase complied with constitutional standards governing capital sentencing. Sutton also raised concerns about appellate counsel, alleging that the lawyer handling his appeals after trial had not adequately challenged certain procedural decisions and had failed to compile a complete record for review. Specifically, the petition asserted that opportunities were missed to contest the admission of evidence and to secure instructions that might have highlighted residual doubt about Sutton's culpability. In May 2006, the Court of Criminal Appeals of Tennessee reviewed Sutton's petition. The court examined each of the major claims and the factual basis offered to support them. After deliberation, the panel concluded that the trial and appellate proceedings did not contain reversible errors under the state's post-conviction standards. The court found that many of the allegations either had been previously raised, had been waived, or did not demonstrate the level of prejudice required to overturn Sutton's conviction. The Tennessee Supreme Court later considered direct appeals challenging both the convictions and the death sentences. Among issues reviewed were claims related to courtroom procedures, instructions to the jury, and how evidence was admitted. In official opinions, the court affirmed the convictions and the sentences imposed on Sutton and his co-defendant. Following state-level appeals, Sutton pursued federal avenues, including petitions for writs of certiorari. According to National Court Tracking Information, his final petition to the United States Supreme Court was denied in March 2016, confirming that his appeals through both state and federal channels had been exhausted. These legal developments meant that courts at multiple levels had consistently upheld the original findings and sentences. By the time Sutton's execution date was reset by the Tennessee Supreme Court for December 3, 2026, legal experts noted that his case had completed its available appeal options and stood as a matter of final judgment. If the persistence of legal arguments and long-term review in this case raises questions in your mind about how justice is administered, subscribe to the Execution Lab today. Comment below on what aspect of the appeals process you find most critical. Your perspective drives deeper discussions and keeps this channel at the forefront of legal reporting. In the final years leading up to the end of 2025 and into early 2026, attention turned back to the legal status and scheduled outcome for Gary Wayne Sutton. On September 30, 2025, the Supreme Court of Tennessee issued a formal order resetting Sutton's execution date to December 3, 2026, after procedural delays and statewide pauses in executions were lifted. The order instructed prison officials to notify Sutton about the execution method and procedural details at least a month before the scheduled date. This reset did not come without renewed public response. In January 2026, a group of Sutton's family members, friends, and supporters gathered at the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville to call on Governor Bill Lee to intervene. They asserted that unresolved questions about the case, including concerns over the reliability of certain scientific testimony and discrepancies in trial procedures, merited a formal executive review before the execution could proceed. Among those present was Carolyn Miller, a longtime friend of Sutton, who publicly maintained that he did not commit the acts he was convicted of, emphasizing his long history of proclaiming his innocence. Supporters highlighted the absence of a clear motive in the official records and noted that the key scientific opinion relied on at trial came from a medical examiner later stripped of his license for professional misconduct. Sutton's attorneys, including Randy Spivey, also issued statements expressing profound disappointment that the execution date was reinstated without addressing what they described as serious issues in the original case. Spivey reiterated that there was no direct evidence linking Sutton to the death of Tommy Griffin, and that the scientific testimony relied upon was compromised. Counsel also noted that Sutton has documented intellectual limitations, an issue that had remained part of ongoing legal filings. In contrast, Blount County District Attorney Ryan Desmond issued a clear position defending the convictions. Desmond noted that both Sutton's and Dellinger's convictions had been upheld through every available appellate review at the state and federal levels. According to his public statement, courts had found no evidence to suggest the convictions were invalid or that Sutton was not responsible for the deaths of Griffin and Connie Branam. The procedural context for Sutton's scheduled execution reflects broader developments in Tennessee's capital punishment system. The state had paused executions in recent years while reviews and revisions were made to execution protocols. Once those revisions were completed, the Supreme Court systematically reset execution dates for several inmates, including Sutton. Hunger for clear answers and legal closure on these matters has animated public and legal attention as the date approached. Amid this backdrop, Sutton's supporters have continued to press their concerns about his case through legal briefs and public forums, arguing that unresolved questions about evidence and court procedure justify additional review. Meanwhile, prosecutors and the courts have maintained that the convictions and sentences are legally sound and have resisted calls for reopening the matter. As the December 3, 2026 date approaches, these competing positions, entrenched and unresolved, frame the final chapter of this long-running legal process. In the years following the legal resolution of initial appeals, the case of Gary Wayne Sutton continued to resonate far beyond courtroom walls. As December 3, 2026 approached, attention shifted not only to the scheduled execution but also to how the community, family members, and legal advocates responded to this long-standing case. Among those most vocal was Stella Griffin Whitted, the older sister of Tommy Griffin and Connie Branam. Stella attended every trial in both Blount and Sevier counties, fulfilling a commitment she made to her mother, who died shortly after the first convictions. She publicly stated that the convictions brought a measure of accountability for her siblings, and she consistently defended the jury's decisions, emphasizing that the legal process had upheld the findings across multiple levels of review. In contrast, Sutton's family and supporters maintained that serious questions remained unresolved even after years of litigation. Throughout 2024 and 2025, his relatives and advocates regularly highlighted what they described as discrepancies in the original investigation and trial. They pointed to the absence of direct evidence linking Sutton to the offenses and the reliance on a now discredited medical expert whose testimony helped establish the timeline used against him. Multiple supporters traveled to Nashville to speak at legislative gatherings and community forums, urging Governor Bill Lee and state officials to take a closer look at Sutton's case before the scheduled execution date. They argued that a re-examination of key evidence, particularly that which was introduced through expert testimony that was later questioned, should occur in the interest of fairness and due process. Statements from Sutton's attorney, Randy Spivey, reiterated these concerns. Spivey emphasized that there was no documented motive for the offense and that the scientific testimony linking Sutton to critical aspects of the case came from an examiner later reprimanded by professional oversight boards. He also noted that Sutton's intellectual and psychological assessments had not been fully considered in early stages of the process, a point his team argued could have bearing on questions of judgment and culpability. Voices from the legal community weighed in as well, with some commentators observing that the path from investigation to conviction involved heavy reliance on circumstantial evidence. These analysts underscored that while courts consistently upheld the convictions, the broader body of evidence and prosecutorial narrative had remained a source of debate. Public commentary also emerged from outside Tennessee. National legal reform organizations and criminal justice scholars cited Sutton's case in discussions about capital sentencing standards and the use of expert testimony in serious criminal cases. They used it as an example in broader debates over how the justice system handles complex evidence and evolving standards of scientific reliability. This ongoing controversy ignited passionate responses across multiple audiences: family members of victims, supporters of Sutton, legal observers, and citizens concerned about fairness in the justice system. The dialogue surrounding the scheduled execution grew louder as the date approached, tying together legal process, individual interpretation of the evidence, and differing views on how justice should be administered in cases with lingering questions. As the scheduled execution date drew closer, one of the most contested aspects of the Gary Wayne Sutton case centered on how evidence was handled, interpreted, and presented to juries decades earlier. At the heart of the dispute were questions about the strength of the proof used to secure the convictions in both blunt and severe counties, and whether the legal process met the standards expected for capital cases. One of the critical elements challenged by Sutton's defense and supporters was the reliability of the scientific evidence relied upon by the prosecution. Sutton's legal team repeatedly noted that key expert testimony came from a former state medical examiner, Dr. Charles Harlan, whose professional credibility was compromised after he was suspended and later lost his license due to inaccuracies in other cases. Defense statements highlighted that this testimony was used to fix a timeline for events, which the prosecution said linked Sutton to alleged actions. This point of contention became central in many filings and public discussions about the case. Another disputed topic concerned the absence of what defense lawyers described as direct evidence tying Sutton to the incidents. Attorneys for Sutton emphasized that, according to them, there was no evidence showing motive or behavior patterns that directly established his involvement in the deaths. As a result, much of the state's case relied on circumstantial evidence, which by definition requires inferences and interpretation rather than proof of concrete actions performed by a defendant. Throughout legal filings and public statements, Sutton's supporters argued this point as a fundamental reason for further review. The indictment itself became another subject of legal scrutiny. In post-conviction filings, Sutton's defense questioned whether procedural expectations were met in drafting the charges that justified the sentence imposed. They argued that certain statutory requirements for aggravating circumstances were not stated clearly enough at the outset, potentially affecting eligibility for a death sentence under governing legal standards. These arguments were reviewed in state and federal courts as part of the long array of appeals and post-conviction challenges filed over the years. Despite these claims, courts at multiple levels of the judicial system repeatedly found that the evidence presented at trial, even when viewed as circumstantial, met the legal threshold for conviction. In appeals and post-conviction decisions, judges pointed to independent witness testimony and ballistic evidence that tied items found at key locations to items recovered from property connected to Sutton's co-defendant, James Henderson Dellinger. These decisions were grounded in Tennessee law permitting inference of guilt when a web of interconnected evidence allows no reasonable alternative interpretation. Legal observers who have examined the case noted that the appellate courts gave deference to jury findings, emphasizing that jurors assessed credibility and weighed evidence in accordance with the standards applied in Tennessee's criminal justice system. These courts affirmed that the procedural conduct during trials and subsequent hearings fell within acceptable bounds of criminal procedure, and that claims of missteps or omissions did not, in their view, undermine the validity of the verdicts. Experts and commentators outside the case have also cited the Sutton matter in broader discussions about how circumstantial evidence and expert testimony are handled in serious criminal cases, especially those involving capital sentences. It has been referenced in academic and legal reform circles as an example of how the interpretation of indirect evidence and the reliability of expert opinion can have significant consequences for defendants and their families. The enduring tension between legal affirmation and continuing dispute reflects not only the specifics of the Sutton case but also broader debates over standards of proof, evidence handling, and fairness in the justice system. These themes have been part of legal filings, public commentary, and ongoing analysis as advocates on both sides continue to frame the case to align with their viewpoints. The repeated appeals and reviews in this case highlight the importance of legal oversight. Each motion, each hearing, ensures that no step is skipped and that justice is not only served but seen to be served. It demonstrates that the law provides multiple layers of review to safeguard against mistakes, and that even under public scrutiny, these safeguards must be respected. If you want a deeper understanding of how courts handle disputed evidence and the legal standards that shape serious criminal convictions, subscribe to the Execution Lab right now. Share your thoughts in the comments about whether you think circumstantial evidence should carry the same weight as direct proof. Your engagement helps us explore these legal debates thoroughly. In the closing chapter of this documentary, we examine the legal finality, continuing controversy, and broader questions surrounding one of Tennessee's most discussed death penalty cases. This segment focuses strictly on verified developments and credible commentary, presented in a way that informs and prompts reflection without overlapping prior or upcoming sections. By late 2025 and into 2026, official records show that Gary Wayne Sutton's appeals were exhausted. According to national legal listings, his final petition for review by the United States Supreme Court was denied in March 2016. And he has been categorized among death row inmates whose legal options have been fully pursued and closed in the federal and state system. The Tennessee Supreme Court issued an order on September 30, 2025, formally resetting Sutton's execution date for December 3, 2026. The procedural order instructed correctional officials to notify Sutton and relevant parties by early November 2026 regarding the execution method to be used under Tennessee law. This reset followed an earlier reprieve that halted executions statewide in 2022, when the governor temporarily paused all executions due to concerns about execution protocols. Revisions to procedures in 2024 allowed executions to resume, enabling courts to schedule new dates for individuals including Sutton. In public statements issued after the schedule was announced, Sutton's attorney reaffirmed key concerns about the case, citing the reliance on testimony from a former medical examiner whose credibility was later questioned and noting that no clear motive or direct evidence had linked Sutton to the events of 1992. Supporters continue to emphasize these issues as part of their efforts to seek clemency or review. At the same time, prosecutors and legal authorities maintained that the criminal convictions had been upheld through every available appellate review and that no evidence had emerged to suggest that the convictions were invalid or that Sutton was not responsible for the crimes as determined by the juries and courts. Statements by Blount County prosecutors noted this repeated affirmation through the judicial process. As the scheduled date approached, Sutton's family and friends engaged in advocacy efforts, including a rally at the Tennessee State Capitol in early 2026. Speakers at that event urged state leadership to conduct additional review, arguing that unresolved questions about the investigation and trial procedures warranted further examination before any final action. Supporters cited concerns about how evidence was evaluated, how scientific testimony was presented, and the fact that Sutton has maintained his innocence for decades. Some also noted ongoing debates about whether individuals with documented intellectual challenges should face capital punishment, an issue that has been addressed in other legal contexts in Tennessee and nationwide. Opposing views were voiced by representatives of the judicial process who underscored the repeated affirmation of convictions and sentences through review at multiple levels. These contrasting positions highlight the broader tension between legal procedures that define guilt and sentence and the perceptions of fairness held by members of the public and some legal commentators. This documentary concludes with the acknowledgement that the legal process, appeals review, and scheduled execution date reflect the current official status of the Sutton case, while the ongoing dialogue among family members, advocates, legal experts, and observers continues to shape public understanding of this long and complex legal journey. Beyond the courtroom, this case demonstrates how awareness, responsibility, and engagement can make a real difference. Families, communities, and legal organizations remind us that every voice matters in ensuring justice is carried out carefully and fairly. It leaves a clear message: staying informed, questioning decisions thoughtfully, and acting responsibly are essential not only for the justice system but for our communities as a whole. Each of us plays a part in supporting fairness and accountability in society. If you want to see comprehensive reviews and deep dives into legal controversies like this one, cases that test the boundaries of evidence, appeals, and legal process, subscribe to the Execution Lab now. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think cases with unresolved questions deserve new review before reaching final resolution? Your engagement guides further analysis and discussion.